Hello, my name is Andreina,
And my name is Gabriela, and this is Wigs and Candles.
a podcast about two sisters and their obsession with period film.
Join us on a trip through palaces and manors, balls and tea parties, and a lot of dresses, carriages, and of course, wigs and candles.
In this episode, bring me my wig. So, Gabi, here we are.
Yes, can you believe it? We somehow made it to season 6.
Yeah, it's hard to believe. We have had a somewhat challenging time in the last few months, but making this podcast brings us so much joy, and the best part of it is that we get to spend time together talking about wigs and candles. So, welcome to season 6.
Yes, welcome. We have reviewed 30 movies over the last 5 seasons.
Yeah, that's a lot of wigs.
Indeed. So it was about time that we honored the name of our podcast. We dedicated the last season to movies about artists and their art. So this season, we want to look at the elements of period film, those characteristics that make a film to be considered period film or not.
Yeah. For example, today we'll look at wigs, but in the next few episodes, we'll look at things like costumes, period film tropes, or classic characters that usually you find in period films, or even how other genres can incorporate aspects of period film to create something unique.
We hope to have figured it out by the end of the season, at least for us, or maybe that we have found some answers.
Yeah. We will try. We will try to see if we can at least have found some answers by the end. Um, so, Gabi, we really love wigs. But have you ever thought about how much you know about wigs?
Well, I haven't really thought about it, but while thinking about it, I realized I knew nothing about wigs. But funnily enough, chances are I came across a very interesting video the other day.
Oh, okay.
And, it happened to be a video about the history of wigs.
Oh, all
There
right.
you go. And I learned a lot.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Well, you know what? That is so interesting because I went to the library and I also came across a small book about the history of hair.
What a perfect
Such a
coincidence.
coincidence.
So,
um,
through your book, did you find anything about wigs in that book?
yeah. It was a big book about hair, so they definitely talk about wigs. And one of the first things I learned about the history of hair and the history of wigs is that people have used wigs for thousands of years. For example, wearing wigs was a common practice in ancient Egypt, and wearing wigs was a symbols of high status. For example, in many cases.
Well, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. But now that you mention it, I can perfectly picture Cleopatra and her iconic hairdo, which most likely was a wig.
Yeah, definitely. That's the first thing that you will think about when you think about wigs and ancient Egypt. And yeah, I found a cool website called Curationist because I was trying to find more information about wigs in ancient Egypt. And what they said in this very cool website was that wigs in ancient Egyptians were very sophisticated and elaborate. The hair was sometimes threaded through gold rings, and they were really thick and heavy. Um, the main reason they explain, or the reason why they started to wear wigs, or the most common reason, was that they wore wigs to protect them from lice. They would shave their heads and wear this because it was the easiest way to protect themselves from lice. So they will keep their hair short and use wigs instead.
That's very interesting.
Makes sense,
Makes
yeah.
total sense. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. What about the video that you watched?
Yes. The video that I watched focused on European wigs. So I think it's interesting that you brought the ancient Egyptian wigs. So in this video that I watched, they mentioned that in Europe, people started using wigs by the end of the 15th century, and it has mostly a kind of gross reason because it's linked to syphilis. As we know, this terrible sexually transmitted disease was widely spread among courtiers, of course, due to high
Oh,
promiscuity, and of course the hygiene standards were very low,
well, different. Yeah, well,
very
different. Yeah.
different. So one of the symptoms of syphilis was hair loss.
Oh,
So they wore
I didn't know that.
wigs. Yeah, they wore wigs to hide baldness and also the scars
Mm.
that the disease leaves on your head once you lose
Oh,
your hair.
wow. Oh, wow, wow.
Yeah, really not a nice reason to start with the business of wigs. Um, but apparently, this is how it started. Um, as we do, and everybody can imagine, wigs could not be easily washed. So
Mm.
eventually, the wigs grew the lice.
Oh,
Yes,
no.
and it smelled terrible. So people used perfumes on the wigs to cover up the smell. I can only imagine it made it
Mm.
just worse.
Ish. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So even though at some point wigs kind of became a symbol of royalty and status, people started using them less and less because,
Mm.
yeah, maybe it was at some point at a fashion. It took a couple of 100 years, but still. So by the time of the French Revolution, they were, and I quote, left to rot.
Oh my God. So sweaty weeks was a real thing.
Totally, literally, a very sweaty incident.
Wow. So we do have some historical historical facts that back up our sweaty weeks, rating and discussions, like, I guess.
Most
Yeah, that,
definitely.
what, yeah, most definitely. Yeah, I also read about wigs during the 17th and 18th century, and I actually learned a lot. um and one of the things that I found most fascinating was that in terms of fashion, in the 17th and 18th century, wigs were mainly worn by men. And as you mentioned, after they became fashionable, they became, well, I read this piece, I'm not sure if you mentioned this, but they became a marker to distinguish between rich and poor. And, wigs represented a class barrier. Like, it was at the beginning, the early mm, beginning of the 18th century, it was really difficult to, for a non-aristocrat to be able to afford a wig. I like to read a brief quote from the book I read, and the book is called Fashions in Hair: The First 5,000 Years by Richard Corson. I quote: Wigs came as a broad mark to distinguish rich and poor. And though beginning only at the price of £3 or £4, they soon rose to £50 and were indeed a formidable class barrier. Close quote. And the reason they were so expensive is that over time, like you said, they became very elaborate. And at some point, they became very large and heavy. And one of the things you mentioned, that, by the time the French Revolution came and they were literally left to rot, was, first of all, fashion, but mainly because they represented aristocracy. So, a more simplified, more natural hairstyle and clothing, that was that was, a symbol that you were not aristocrat, that you were for the revolution. So that's another important piece of why wigs, disappeared,
Started
essentially.
declining. Yes. Yes,
Yeah,
yes, of
yeah,
course.
yeah.
That makes total sense. Um,
Hmm.
maybe it's also interesting to dig into why they were so expensive. you know. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe it has to do with the fact of where the hair came from. So
Mm.
sometimes they use animal hair from horses,
Mm.
but
Okay.
sometimes they also use human hair. Yeah. Poor women
Oh,
would sell their hair for, of course, for money.
yeah. Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
maybe one interesting fact, do you know which kind of hair was the most popular? This is I found very interesting. So
No, I don't.
blonde and silver gray were the most popular colors.
Silver
Silver
gray.
gray,
Wow.
followed by black hair.
Okay.
And the most popular was naturally curly hair. So my
Hmm.
hair would have been very fashionable for a week.
Yeah. Wow, Gabby.
Yeah,
That's a
that's
good
interesting.
that's good to know. That's good to know.
I
Yeah.
could have sold my hair for a curly week. In fact, straight hair was made curly, so they really like curls.
Okay.
So later on, from the 18th century onwards, people started coloring and bleaching their wigs, and it would depend on the
Mm.
fashion. I think we all have this very clear image of Marie Antoinette's entourage, maybe a little bit before. And they're all wearing very bright wigs. They're really just blonde or silver
Mm-hmm.
gray or really just very white.
Yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. I think the two of the things that you mentioned, about the curly hair and the silver gray or white, is just some. Those are some of the most um like immediate images that you have when you think about the wigs of the 18th century. It's like a pale color wig or white, the powdered wig, but also curls. And in that book that I was reading, they also talk a lot about hairstyles, and definitely the curls, the more elaborate curls, like they just became more and more and more, more abundance of curls and more curls as the century went along. So it's a little crazy. Um, and that makes me think that it's always fascinating to learn what was considered fashionable at different time periods. For example, because wigs at the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century were still very expensive, and as I mentioned, it was a class barrier. Men who could not afford to buy a wig, they will style their hair to look as a wig as much as possible. So the wig became the style, and it was replicated with people's
Own
real
hair.
hair.
Wow.
Yeah, it's just, yeah, people's own hair. And also something that I never had thought about, that I learned in this amazing book, was that there were many styles of wigs to choose from. Like, it was not just the one wig, one style. No, there were, at the same time, simultaneously, like at the same time, there will be different styles of wigs that people could choose from. And the most interesting part is that um, there were specific wigs that were more appropriate for different professions. If you allow me, I would like to quote the book again.
Go ahead.
It's a little bit of a longish quote, but I'm gonna try to be fast. So, I open quotes. So, one of the most curious aspects of the 18th century men's hair, apart from the almost universal use of wigs, is the identification of certain styles with certain professions. Normally, the leaders of fashion set the style, which gradually gains acceptance among the middle and lower classes. Then, in turn, makes it necessary for the leaders to develop new styles if they have not already done so. This also happened in the 18th century, but at the same time, there were professional groups who, on the whole, stuck to their conventional wigs, though there were fashion followers in every group. So, one of the end quotes. So, one of the professions that you might think immediately is lawyers. There was a specific type of wig that lawyers would wear, and then that I don't know, clerks would wear. Like, and the week that lawyers that we think about, even today, those very long weeks that fall here, they are very I think they call them bottom heavy, and they kind of were the style at the end of the 17th century, and they kind of remain. But it's very interesting to know that different profession, and specifically men, had to wear these wigs. It's like a hat, or certain jobs demand that you wear a tie, but then different jobs require you to wear a certain style wig, like smaller, less curls, or big. I mean, it's just so interesting how that you know a person started wearing them, and then they become fashionable, and then they become rules,
Hmm.
even like it's just so
Like a
fascinating to
formal
me.
part of
Anyway,
the attire. Yes.
exactly, yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
Very
So
interesting, and we might get to talk about specifically that later on, because looking back to our five
yeah.
seasons of this podcast and the 30 movies we have watched and reviewed in the past, we have
So
seen a lot of weeks. We have seen a
yeah,
lot of
yeah,
weeks,
yeah, we
and
have.
many of them have been very memorable. So I would like to ask you, out of all those, which weeks are the most memorable for you?
Thank you for asking, Gabby. Yeah, we have reviewed 30 movies. Uh, but to start, when I start to think about it, obviously not all the movies that we have watched in our podcast have wigs in them, because they take place at different time periods when wigs were no longer in fashion. So there was a smaller number of movies that had wigs. Um, However, as soon as we decided to do this episode and think about the weeks that were most memorable, the first one that came to my mind was Barry Lyndon. This is the we discussed this movie in season 4, and this is a 1975 movie by Stanley Kubrick. Um, and the reason I thought about this movie immediately is because this movie is visually perfect. It's a true visual masterpiece. It's so much so that at time it feels like you are seeing real 18th century people, or even being like paintings come to life. This movie is extraordinary. I know people who love period film probably have seen this movie, but if you haven't seen this film, this is a must if you love period films. But I was also thinking that the fascination with the 18th century, for me at least, I guess maybe you share the same fascination with me, comes in great part from the fashion and the fact that these elaborate wigs became the norm. Like how did this happen? That's why it's been so interesting to me to learn about the history of the fashion. The fact that in some cases, actually in one of the most important cases, it started from need and vanity, like you mentioned, to hide the scars, and also vanity, to cover your baldness, or yeah. But then it became pure fantasy. Isn't that interesting? Like it started as a need, and then it becomes fantasy, and a lot of fashion evolves that way.
Totally.
What do you
That
think?
it
Yeah.
it kind of sparked more and more the creativity, and yeah, and the fantasy of having like luscious, healthy, abundant, curly hair. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and in fact, this fantasy you talk about at some point, even though it was just like a fantasy, even that fantasy also became the norm and
Yeah.
went beyond the creation of wigs so much that at some point in history, specifically around the times of when the story of Barry Lyndon takes place, women were, as you mentioned also before, they were recreating the wigs look with their own hair. So
Yeah.
it reached a peak, and at some point people were like, okay, if we can do that with wigs, we can also do that with hair, our own hair. And they started making all these styles with their own hair, and there's a famous wig that looks like a battleship. Yeah, there's images of that. And that
Yeah,
was
this
with
this is
that was with apparently real hair. So coming back to Barry Lyndon,
yeah.
which is exactly this era where this fantasy was most lived out by
Like
people.
yeah, at its
Yeah,
peak,
it's
at
at
its
its
peak. Yeah,
peak. We definitely have to give the crew behind Barrilino. We have to give them some credits, um, because they definitely created amazing wigs for this to fit exactly this style. And I think you mentioned it, and I totally agree with you. This is some of the most memorable images in cinema, in cinema
oh my
history.
gosh, yeah, period.
Period.
Yeah, period.
Period.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
not even period, not even
No,
in
period. No,
period,
in
but not in
cinema.
period film.
Period.
Yeah,
Because they do look very extravagant, but yet
yeah,
very accurate to the
yeah,
period.
yeah, 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 and yeah, and you're right, Gabby. Um, um, at some point, like we have been, like how we find out, we learned that at some point the wigs were the norm more for men than women. That was this was an interest. Like, this was one of the most interesting pieces of this whole learning experience, because as I learned from the book, women wore wigs, of course, but they wore them mostly in social occasions and for writing. Writing will be one of those occasions. I guess, to protect your hair from, I don't know. I don't know what the logic is behind this one. But but as you've been saying, in general, women had elaborate hairstyles. So while men were wearing the wigs, women were recreating the wig look with their own hair, and these hairstyles became extremely elaborate, like higher and higher, and using all kinds of things to construct them and build them. uh, if I may, I want to quote again from the book. I think because the book says it better than I could. So, quote, women powder their hair for court. Sorry, I'll start again. So yeah, women had elaborate hairstyles, and we haven't mentioned the powder yet, but the book mentions it in this part. So quote: women powder their hair for court wear, and sometimes for full dress occasions. The usual color being white. So it was for them. It was mostly hairstyle, and the color will be you know come from the powder. Yeah, but and we can see this very well in Barry Lyndon, because Lady Lyndon, who's the main female character in the movie, she wears these very elaborate hairstyles, and even some of the more idiosyncratic styles that changed through the decades. There was this like very curly style that is like kind of fluffy, like kind of frizzy, and she wears like that kind of hairstyle too. Like, that book that I read was fascinating because it had plates of so many styles throughout the decades, and that the ones that she wore were so iconic. But anyway, what about you? What's your most memorable week from the movies that we have seen?
Well, Nene, considering what we have learned so far, what you have um, learned from your book and what I learned from my video, um,
Such a
such a
coincidence.
coincidence. I would like to highlight the wigs in Belle. And you might think, okay, Belle is completely different from Barry Lyndon in style and in period.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But in this film from 2013, and which was directed by Amma Asante, and we discussed this film in season one. In this
Mm-hmm.
film, um, the story includes lawmakers. So, if I can just recap shortly, in this story, the
Yes.
adoptive father of Belle, played by Tom Wilkinson, is a lawmaker, and he is also a judge. So he's a lawyer and a judge of court. So this gives us the opportunity to see the role of the wig for someone in this profession. As you mentioned before, it was not only just fashion, it became kind of part of the official attire of
Yeah.
professions, especially lawmakers. So, specifically in this film, we see Belle's stepfather, Lord Mansfield, sometimes wearing like a classical daily wig, which would be white and powder, and it would have like two curls on each side. Um, and if you take a closer look, we will put some photos in our
Yeah.
notes. If you
Yeah.
take a closer look, you can very well see the gap between the wig and the forehead, which is, I think, completely intentional to kind of really give you the sense this was a wig,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
and
Uh-huh.
not his real hair. So I think this is it's a very nice detail from the
Mm-hmm.
filmmakers. And on other scenes, we also see him wearing the judge wig because he was a judge. And this is completely different. This is the one you mentioned that is like a
Yeah, the
lot of
long
corals and it
ones.
falls to both shoulders. Completely different. And then there's also a scene where we see Lord Mansfield not wearing any wig and wearing like a
Mm.
beanie, like a just like a little hat, um,
A nightcap.
like a nightcap. Yes. So I think this is like a perfect film to pay attention
Mm.
to wigs,
Mm-hmm.
and how versatile they were as an accessoire, and also how you mentioned that it was like a status symbol. It was
Mm-hmm.
not for everybody. In fact, there is a character in the film, the man who falls in love with Belle, who was just an apprentice of Lord Mansfield, and therefore not an aristocrat. And he is not wearing any wig.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is also kind of a very nice and accurate portrayal of who was entitled to wear a wig. And
Yeah.
he was still not there yet. Um, so yes, I think the wigs, even though they're not very prominent and they don't play a real dominant role in this film, they give a perfect example of this versatility of wigs in the
Yeah.
context of a profession.
When you talk about this movie, it also made me think of this character, John Davini. He was learning to be, studying to be a lawyer, and he wears one of the most classic hairdos when you think of the 18th century as well, for men, which was natural hair in a ponytail with a ribbon. So he wears this throughout the movie as well. And it made me, just thinking about his hairstyle. It reminds me of, in this book, there were a lot of letters, like from the period, authentics. And there was this letter from a dad to a young son. And it's interesting that, the dad was saying, "Oh, you're too young to wear a wig. Your hair is so beautiful. It would be just such a shame for you to cover your hair with a wig." So we can see that the wigs were the fashion and also a requirement, like official requirement for certain professions, but there was also kind of a lot of freedom in some way as well. Like young men were not necessarily required to wear a wig. They could just wear their hair, and in that very classic, with the ribbon at the back. And yeah, I think it's interesting to see that it was not like a rigid thing. It was people have freedom, people have choice.
Yes.
Yeah. So the second most memorable movie to me when we think about wigs is Chevalier. This is a 2022 film that tells the story of the real life composer and musician Joseph Bologne, who was one of the few black composers that, against all odds and barriers, rose to prominence in France in the 18th century. And we discussed this movie in season 3. And the reason why the wigs are memorable in this movie is that the wigs are part of the character development of Joseph Bologna. Like we were talking about the weeks in Belle, and we're talking about how they they say important things about, they reveal things about the characters, but they're more in the background, where here it seems like they're more in the foreground. So to start, Joseph Bologna is a black man who, he grew up in France, so he could study music. He was a prodigy, and he has to, it's the fashion. He wears wigs, um, and the wigs in this movie are very, very neat and clean. And when we discuss the movie, we notice this, we talk about this, and it's clearly an artistic choice. It's clearly a choice to reveal something about this character, or to emphasize something. So the fact that he was a black man, first of all, wearing a wig that replicates straight hair, the color, right, is white, or is, light color, first of all. And second of all, the wigs were a clear symbol of the aristocracy. They were a fashion and a class symbol, like we learned. So by Chevalier, Joseph Bologna, wearing this wig, he's already taking on several layers that are that he has to assume to be able to start to maybe gain some access to those spaces. But something very interesting happens in the movie, and this is why it's more in the foreground, is that Joseph Bologna, his mother was a enslaved person. She was a slave, and she's freed at some point, and they reunite when Chevalier is already an adult. And when he and his mom reunite, he starts to reconnect, obviously, with his history, with his culture. And there are very moving scenes in this movie that relate to her. In particular, one scene where his mother, they're talking. She braids his hair, and they're talking about, what the life of a slave is like, and so on. So from then on, he starts to wear the wig much, much less. So he starts to assume more his real, accept his culture, and to go into the world with his natural hair. So I think this movie is very interesting when you see how they use the wigs. Some of the most neat and beautiful wigs
They were
that
so
we have
sleek.
seen. They were so perfect this week. So anyway, what do you remember? Yeah, what do you
Nenny,
remember
definitely
about
that it
this
was a very
movie?
interesting element in the entire costume design. Otherwise, we wouldn't have highlighted it when we reviewed the film. And as you mentioned, that it was not just an
Mm-hmm.
accessory, it's also
Mm-hmm.
part of the story because of
Yeah.
this dichotomy of a black man wearing straight hair wig. So it was definitely part of the story. It played a bigger role than just being, uh,
Yeah.
fashionable,
Yeah.
accurate, fashionable element in the film.
Gabby, I am so happy that we had the chance to learn about such an important topic for us in this podcast. Because we are clearly obsessed with wigs and candles, and now we have explored one half of our name. So I think that was something that was overdue.
Yes, Nene. I'm also happy that we took the opportunity to review some of the most memorable weeks and styles from the movies that we have watched together. Um, and it was, of course, most necessary to honor this incredible accessory, which is our name giver.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I can believe that we went 6 seasons, or well, 5 seasons, without actually learning a little bit about our obsession, which is wigs. So it was really, it was actually really interesting, Gabby. And so, as always, thank you so much for your insights, for everything that you explained to us today. It was so much fun. I really, really enjoyed it, and I learned a lot.
Same here, Nene. It was definitely a lot of fun, very delightful, and interesting.
And thank you everybody for listening. We hope you also learn a couple things about Wigs. So see you next time.
Yes, maybe you feel tempted to pay more attention to Wigs next time you watch a period film.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So again, thank you for listening, and see you next time. Bye bye.
Stay tuned.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Wigs and Candles is written, hosted, and produced by Andreina Romero and Gabriela Moken Romero. The image design is by Pamela Rowling. The podcast theme music is the Concerto for Two Violins in D minor by Johann Sebastian Bach.